Well, what I'd like to begin as a focus is the leadership spill that happened in June. What we saw there was a structural removal of power and a structural regaining of power. We saw allegiances shift, allegiances identified. We saw also values positioning as people were saying that they were acting in the best interest of the nation. And there was also the extraordinary conflicting argument that despite Gillard having achieved an incredible track record, that we needed to look at the party and the preservation of the party, and that the polling was indicating that the party wasn't going to survive. So amidst all those mixed messages, Steve, I'd like to ask you, you were right there experiencing these events. Can you give us a sense of what you were making of them?
Sure, thanks Diane. Nobody goes into decisions like that lightly. And I can tell you, sitting in a room full of 104 people, nobody thought that what they were doing in casting a vote on that leadership ballot was an easy thing. I can tell you what was going through my mind, and it was this, that I joined a political party because I wanted to see some outcomes. I wanted to see things done for the nation, and the party that I joined best aligned to my values. The party doesn't exist in and of itself or for itself. It exists to do things and to make some changes. And I'm sure if you ask Gareth the same question about the party that he joined, he'd give you a similar answer. The party doesn't exist in and of itself. It exists to make changes that the people who belong to it believe in. So when I was contemplating how I would cast a vote in that party room, I looked on the very great record, I thought a commendable record of the policy changes, the legislation, the decisions that former Prime Minister Julia Gillard had helped shepherd through the Parliament, a very difficult Parliament, a reform agenda that probably would have stopped some leaders with a much fatter majority, whether it's industrial relations changes, whether it's getting the legislation through to roll out a national broadband network, whether it's the school education. I've rattled off, there's literally been about 540 pieces of legislation, fantastic reforms, but I formed the opinion that if we kept going the way we were, that all of those changes would have amounted to nothing, because Tony Abbott had made it quite clear that he intended to spray paint them all out of history. So for mine, it was about preserving the legacy and ensuring that we got an opportunity to extend that into the future. So think about when you change government, I think it was Paul Keating said, when you change your government, you actually do change the nation. And governments of all persuasions, you actually need a bit of time to bed in the changes that you make. If you keep changing from one to the other, any of the changes that you make aren't difficult. So they were the things that were going through my mind as I exercised my vote. I supported Kevin. People said to me, that's strange because I thought you were mates with Julia. I was, for me. When I joined the party and when I joined Parliament, I knew that there was always something more important than me as an individual. It was what we were trying to do for the nation.
Can I just perhaps pick up on a few things that you've said, just in terms of the perceptions people had, because there was a lot of discussion about the morality of what had happened and the ethics of what was going on. Do you feel that perhaps tactically what had happened was quite powerful, that it was morally bankrupt?
No, I don't. I don't. And I think for all the reasons that I've just set out, there was a very clear principle that was at stake. And when each and every one of us sticks their hands up to join a political party and as a representative of a political party, become a member of a parliament Parliament and then sit inside a caucus, each and every one of us knows that there is something that is greater than the individual. And what is greater than the individual is the things that you're attempting to achieve for the people that you represent and the nation that you are governing. That's what comes first before anything else. And I think that is the right ethical, moral and principled framework to look at these things. And that doesn't mean, as I'm sure you were suggesting in part, that what goes on in those procedures ain't pretty. Because it isn't. It's not pretty at all, but that shouldn't be confused with there not being sound set principles which underpin it.
I'd just like to also bring you back on the issue of polling. I mean, there's just so much of an emphasis placed on polling, and given that you've just acknowledged that Gillard's track record was magnificent, she was an excellent negotiator and achieved a great deal of legislative reform. The polling said otherwise, and what are your thoughts on how much significance is put on polling and the constant polling that's done from the time someone's elected to the time that they're removed?
I think polling matters only to this extent that it is a reflection of what people think and what they think about what you are doing or how you are performing. I don't think you should be driven by it. Indeed, I hate to say this, but anyone who watched the first 2 years of this government and this parliament following the 2010 election couldn't draw the conclusion that we were poll-driven. Nobody could conclude that we were poll-driven because we weren't tracking that well in the polls. It was 2.5 years. I think you need to have your ear to the ground about the people, what the people you represent are thinking. But there's got to be a greater thing that drives you, and this gets to the point of leadership. I think the role of a leader is not to just stick a mirror up to the electorate and say, whatever you think, I think. Whatever appears through that piece of glass or that mirror is what I'll go out there and say. A leader's got an obligation to do exactly that, to point out what you think is right and to be willing to go out there and have the argument. I've always said I've been involved in social change and representing community organisations, workplace organisations, a whole heap of different causes for 25 years. I've run lots of campaigns. I know at the beginning of the campaign you can always fit people who think it's a good idea inside a phone box. At the end of the campaign, when you look like you're going to win, you've got to hire a hall to fit the people in who thought it was their idea in the first place. The leaders are the people who are in the phone box, not in the hall at the end.
I'd like to ask the rest of the panel then, what do you think led to Gillard's demise? There are lots of commentaries and a post-analysis in society, in the news, and in various quarters. One of the reasons that's been touted is that it was due to dirty politics. Another is that it was due to her strategic flaws. And of course, the other reason is that it was because of her gender. And in defining gender, it would be the entrenched discriminatory differences that we use to perceive women. So I'm just wondering, perhaps if I could start with you, Anna, what do you think led to Gillard's demise?
The first thing that I would say about Prime Minister Gillard at the time was that her legacy will live on. There's no doubt about that. What she had brought into this nation will go on for the next 30, 40 and 50 years. And I think it will take the next 10 years until people really realise the sort of leader she was. I think being the first female Prime Minister of our country, looking through the lens of a male, looking at a female Prime Minister, was probably very confronting for a lot of people. I know that New Zealand had their Prime Minister in Helen Clark, and she went through some similar hurdles. So I think that Julia's legacy will certainly live on, but it's certainly given women, particularly in politics, and I can only speak at state level, and Gareth will know this, the mindset that, you know, we can do the same job, we can do a good job for our electorates regardless of our gender. And I think it's more of a matter of the bed that you're born in, what your beliefs are, and getting that message across. I think that the media played a very large role in what happened to Julia. I mean, her Prime Ministership was followed with great curiosity, and I have never seen, and I've followed politics for a long time, since I was a little girl, you know, that was just the family that I was born into. I had never seen a politician followed intensely by the media that Julia was followed in. So I think she did a magnificent job, and her legacy will certainly live on in regards to you know, the gender issue. I guess, you know, time will tell. You know, maybe in 5 to 10 years we can be having this same conversation and people will have a different view. But my view personally is that you know, the party had an opportunity to turn things around, and we've done just that. And we have a platform, and we have certainly gone back to our grassroots, and that is what I think is important. And I know that I certainly wouldn't have liked to have been in Stephen's position in that caucus federally. It would have been a very hard decision to make, because your heart is saying one thing and you know another. So having said that, I think that you know, looking through, again, the lens of male's eyes to what a female does, especially our first female Prime Minister, I mean, you know, she would have been in a very, very hard position. I certainly would not like to be in her position. So I think it's time that now in this country we need to start looking at that gender balance very, very differently, and look at the skills, qualifications, the knowledge, the actions, the policies that our female leaders have, whether you're the Prime Minister, CEO, a General Manager. I think that it's time that women really started to focus on the job that they're doing rather. It's very hard being a female politician, let me tell you, it's not easy. And there's a lot of hurdles that you need to overcome first. But once you get there and you've established yourself, then you still have to fight, I believe, twice as hard as what the males have to do. I'm an ex-union official, and for 13 years I worked in an office full of males. I was the only female union official in this region for my particular union, and it was very, very difficult. And that's only a small role compared to what Julia Gillard went through. So you really have to prove yourself and work extremely hard to get past those barriers. And I'll give you an example, because I think examples are the best way of explaining how you're feeling. When I first became a union official, I went to my to a gate meeting, okay, of all men. I had 150 local government workers, all men, garbos, rangers, you know, horties, all of that sort of thing. I was the only female in the room, and it took me 20 minutes to get past. I knew it took me 20 minutes for them to get past the fact that I was a female, speaking to them about industrial relations, speaking to them about changes to their award, speaking to them about conditions of employment, changes to their salary structures and all of those sort of things, before it actually started to sink in. So it takes a long time to get past those barriers, and I don't think any time soon is that going to change. But I'm certainly sure that, and I've spoken to a lot of young women here just this evening and within my electorate, there are so many brilliant women coming through, especially in the areas of engineering, and I know Gareth will agree with me on that, where we are really proving ourselves to be, you know, up there with the best of them. So, you know, it's just such a broad issue that we speak about. But as far as our Prime Minister, or ex-Prime Minister is concerned, our previous Prime Minister, I think her legacy will certainly live on for a long, long time.
Thanks very much, Diane. And can I just say thank you to you for organising tonight, and also I see Michael there from my electorate on microphones, and can I also acknowledge Councillor Kathy Rice, who I see in the front row here from Kaiba Council. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight to listen to the four of us. Look, on the question, I don't really mind whether you're a Labor Prime Minister, a Liberal Prime Minister, a Labor Premier or a Liberal Premier. Taking on a role of leadership of that significance involves you over so much of your life. You can't imagine the decisions, the pressure, the strain that has on that one individual. It doesn't matter what side of politics you're from. And I think that there'll always be challenges that confront those people that take on those distinctly and conspicuously public positions of leadership. And like all politicians, politics has a certain set of rules. I mean, ever since those famous words "a tu brute" were uttered, the knife in the back is something that isn't too unfamiliar to people in politics. In fact, one might say that Julia Gillard rose the same way she fell. And in that sense, do I feel sorry for her? I do not. Do I believe that she deserves respect? I do. I think that a lot of people have talked about her gender playing a card. I don't believe so, but mind you, I grew up in a household with a very strong mother. And I'm gender blind in that sense. I think that people need to be judged on their merits and their capacities. Margaret Thatcher would argue she had a much harder time, a much harder time in 1979. Now, agree with her or not, like her policies or not, she took on the Conservative, the Tory party in England at a time when it was still very much a male-dominated society, and I respect her as I respect Julia Gillard as being our Prime Minister for the time that she was Prime Minister. But coming back to your question, Diane, look, I think that political parties, when you have a gathering of people who have several different ideas on who should lead and what direction you should go in, and contrary to public belief, political parties don't always have the same idea. There are people like Stephen who are in the left of his party. There are people like me in the Liberal Party that are in the more moderate wing of my party. And we obviously want the people that we believe in, the ideas that we support, to be running that party. And I'm sure that just as Stephen would have had an extraordinarily difficult decision to make in relation to who should lead the nation, that is a decision that has confronted my party in the past as well. So I'm not going to sit here and get stuck into Labor for having leadership challenges. Gosh, the Liberal Party's had its fair share of those as well too in the past. Those of you that remember, Howard and Peacock, or those of you that remember the days of the state opposition, when we went through Collins and Shigarovsky and Brogden and Debnam and then to O'Farrell, political parties will confront questions of leadership. But I think that the question the community needs to ask itself is, what do those people contribute when they are there? What is their raison d'etre? What is their reason for being? What sort of community do they want to make? Sure, political parties look at polls. Sure, there'll be people in the back room that'll focus on crunching numbers and how many seats are going to win. Because at the end of the day, you can't do anything unless you're in government. You need to be in government to make the contribution that people get into politics for. And I'm sure Sandra can reflect on that as someone who's been an extraordinarily successful independent. But from a party political perspective, there's no doubt that there are difficult decisions that confront people in leadership. Yes, of course, people would be lying to you if they said that polls aren't something that people are considering. But also there are some questions of what direction that party is going in, what decisions have been made, and whether or not you can continue to make the difference that you want to make. I mean, people will talk about the right thing to do. Stephen and I are good mates, but we have very, very different views on what the right thing is to do. We have very different views on how to get there. Mind you, we agree on a lot. But in terms of the way that government services should function, the way taxation should function, we have different views. And so long as there's a healthy debate, so long as there's an informed debate, and so long as it is based on facts and actually getting somewhere, achieving something, I don't mind that people disagree. What I get upset about the most is when divisions become deeply personal, when they become about the individual and the personalities, and not the interests of the future of your local community, your state, or your nation.
Gareth, just before Sandra, just before Gareth concludes, Gareth, you said that you think that the most important thing is what are the people there for? What is their raison d'être?
Yep.
I'd like to ask you though, how can a man and a woman in the Parliament achieve their very best when the actual culture is so skewed that no matter how competent a woman is, that they're looked in that structure through a male lens? And yes, you said that what Gillard did, the way she fell was the way she got in, and I do accept that. That's the man's way, the masculine rules of the game which she played. But putting that aside, I think it's very difficult for a woman to operate in that space because the culture is very male-dominated and very masculine, and you have to play that game. But even so, despite the fact that she achieved within that sphere, she was still vilified for what she had done. And if you look back in terms of leadership skills over the years, there have been several. I mean, there are, about 14 altogether over the years, state and federal. I don't recall a time when someone has been vilified for taking on, challenging another leader. There have been people who have also overturned election promises. I can recall, Hawke's promise by 1990 there'd be no Australian child living in poverty. The GST with Howard was overturned. But they weren't vilified. So I'd like to perhaps ask you, do you think that the considerations that you've brought up perhaps need to bear in mind that it isn't as clear-cut as what you're saying? It is quite difficult.
Well, I think that's probably a question better directed to women in politics. My closest friend in the Parliament is the first female speaker, Shelley Hancock. Shelley was the first female speaker in the lower house, the longest-serving uninterrupted parliamentary democracy in the world, in New South Wales. And when you think about the fact that the Parliament has been operating as a self-governing body since 1856, the fact it took us to 2011 to elect a woman as Speaker to preside is extraordinary. But you know what? Shelley got there on the basis of merit. She got there because, not because she was a woman, not because the Premier wanted to say, we'd appointed a woman Speaker, but because she deserved to be there. And, I think that the gender wars are important. I think it's important to have women in positions of leadership. Gandhi talked about the importance of having women in his cabinet, as have many other leaders. But I think the most important thing is always merit. But look, there'll be people that will say, as you've just highlighted, that there is a difficult road to hoe for women. And I'm sitting next to the longest-serving mayor in Kiama's history, who was a woman and did an exceptional job. Now, Sandra did a great job as mayor, not because she was a woman, but because she was a great mayor. And I think that, you can't lose sight of the achievements that women make, not just because they're women, but because they're women.
And with the question in regard to the leadership of Prime Minister Julia Gillard, I felt that she was an incredibly strong leader for our country. And I really feel that history will remember her very well. And often it's the qualities of leadership or the achievements and policy change that has occurred in that period of leadership. People don't really realise it or appreciate it till further in the future, a long way down in history. I think some of the things that stand out about her leadership was, I think, is to do with her being a very strong woman, but also a compassionate woman. When you look at the policy legislation, things to do with climate change, the national food policy, a lot of those issues to do with the environment, sustainability, for the good of the nation, I think women actually are very strong at developing those policies, and she has certainly made that contribution. It was a hung parliament, and if you remember back to the lead up to the demise of Kevin Rudd from the leadership position, I think she took that role reluctantly, but she did it for the good of the party at that time. And the political reality, and with, I think with the federal election, also the political reality of the change of government, the polling proved that Kevin Rudd was more popular. You read that in papers all the time. The media was very negative towards Julia Gillard, so was the opposition. I think the great strength was when that caucus decision was made, which I think Stephen Jones is filtering with probably a lot more personally than I can. I watched the build-up. I was overseas, and you could actually see with the leakages to the media. I said to my husband, you know, on an iPad, I said there's going to be a spill. But when that occurred and the result was determined, and the speech from Julia Gillard, she accepted that decision for the good of the party and for the discussion of policy. The focus was not on her. The focus in the lead up to the federal election would be on the policies presented by the government and the opposition. And to me, that is what leadership is.
A couple of other observations. When you're in public life, you're only capable of determining some of how the public perceive you. The rest of it's determined by the circumstances, the time, by your opponents and all the rest of it. Following on from your points, Andrew, I think the fact that former Prime Minister Gillard took over in June 2010 and the circumstances in which he took over, together with a hung parliament, guaranteed that the election campaign of 2010 never ended. We have had a 2.5 to 3 year election campaign, and that ebb and flow that normally accompanies a political cycle. Well, you've got plenty of flow and not much ebb. We've been dealing with things at that level of hostility that is normally seen around an election campaign, and we haven't seen it peak off at all. The second thing I really do have to say something about goes to your comments about Parliament and politics being a male or adversarial environment. Well, it's certainly adversarial. I've always, whenever people raise this with me, I say, well, there's always ways to do things better, there's no doubt about it, but the alternative is not sitting around and having a kumbaya night. We are talking about big and important issues here, and there are real and genuine differences that have to be thrashed out. In this country, we deal with it by a debate in Parliament. In other countries, they deal with it by civil war. I know what I'd rather do.